Hi everyone, my name is Kiera Mehigan. I'm a director in Syneos Health's research and development consulting team. For the last 10 years, most of my experience has been in organizational process and technology transformation in clinical development, mostly clinical operations and clinical data science. And for the last 3 years, which has been my time at Syneos Health, I've also been involved in establishing our data science and AI consulting practice. So, helping organizations to understand how to decide what to invest in, how to get value out of, how to run and oversee all of their projects with innovative and disruptive technologies. My talk today is going to be on trends in AI and disruptive technology in clinical development. So, a quick overview of what I'm going to cover today. So, starting off with trends in clinical development, what we're seeing as an industry at the moment, and then moving on to general trends in AI, the technologies that have been evolving, and also how they've been being applied in our industry. And then looking at specifically how we're seeing AI being applied in clinical development at the moment. And then moving on to, if that's what's happening now, then what might be coming next with these technologies. And then also touching a little bit on some of the challenges around implementation that we're seeing. And then I'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So, starting off with what we're seeing in clinical development. So, I think everything on this slide should be quite familiar to a lot of people watching. We're all trying to get the right treatments to the right patients faster. And we have a really complex landscape of clinical development that we're trying to do that in. So we're dealing with cost pressure and time pressure. So trying to do things more efficiently for less money and more quickly. And also there's a big focus, of course, on patient centricity. So trying to be more patient centric in the design and delivery of our clinical trials. We're also handling huge amounts of data nowadays. So we've increased not just the volumes of data massively, but also the complexity, the types. We've got imaging, we've got genomics, we've got eCOA, and we're handling so many more different types and formats from many different sources and vendors. And it's hard to handle that without just hiring many more people to manage it. So that's a big challenge for us at the moment. There's also RBQM, which is risk-based quality management. So a lot of organizations are already doing risk-based monitoring of sites, but I'm sure a lot of us will be familiar with ICH E6R3 guidance that's coming out, which is really emphasizing the importance of risk proportionate approaches beyond just monitoring, also looking at how we handle data as well. So that's a big area of focus. And then, of course, we have quality. So throughout all of this, all of these complex processes, ways of working, technologies, we absolutely need to make sure that we have clear documentation, that we're following clear procedures, and that we're maintaining inspection readiness throughout all of this. So this list isn't necessarily completely exhaustive, but it's a pretty good overview of what we're all handling at the moment. So if I move on now to what we're seeing in AI. So I'm going to take a look at basically what's been coming out in the last 5 to 10 years. If you look down the left-hand side of the slide, see different types of AI tools and methodologies that we have. And I'll just call out a few milestones and breakthroughs that have been coming out over the last years relevant to our industry as well. So if I start with traditional machine learning, so this has been around for decades, and I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with some of the applications around predictive modeling and analytics. But one of the major things that we've seen come out about 10 years ago was IBM Watson for drug discovery. So a high profile cognitive computing platform aimed at target identification. So big breakthrough for us there. Next, we have natural language processing, again, been around for a long time, but one of the more recent releases in 2022 was Gatortron, so the deep mining of unstructured electronic health record text, which has enabled us to extract concepts and increase the accuracy of answering questions. Then if we look at generative AI, so I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with ChatGPT, so generative pre-trained transformers based on large language models. And one of the big advances for that was in 2020 when OpenAI released a GPT-3 API, which basically opened the floodgates for auto drafting of documents. So people have been exploring that in a big way in our industry, and I'll touch on that a bit more later. And of course, I can't mention generative AI without mentioning AlphaFold. So AlphaFold in 2021 released about 350,000 protein structures, which has really, really accelerated our ability to select targets and get hits for treatment. In terms of causal AI, so this is looking not just at correlation between data points, but really understanding why data points are related to each other. And one of the big breakthroughs recently, in 2023, the FDA released guidance on real-world data around causal inference networks, so really enabling this to start to be used for mainstream submissions. And as we get into kind of causal, agentic, and multimodal, we're really looking at the next generation of AI-powered capabilities. So a lot of this is really exploratory and been happening really recently. So if I look at agentic AI, so more autonomous workflows that are doing automated tasks, but based on large language models and reasoning. So one of the big releases that happened just last year was a multi-agent SLR system, which is able to do end-to-end literature review with large language model agents. So searching, screening, summarizing, and rating the analysis it was doing. And then lastly, I look at multimodal AI. So this is around integrating multiple different formats and types of data. So images, multi-omics, electronic health records. And what we've really been seeing is this year even is the first examples of this moving from pilot to early deployment in precision trial design. So huge amounts of advance in AI, and we're starting to see it come through in our industry. But how is this actually being applied in clinical development? So I think one of the main things to say about it is that essentially, if we're looking at what's being used at scale, it really is traditional AI methodologies. And the more next generation tools and technologies are really still in the early stages. And I think it's worth calling out that our industry is highly regulated and is quite conservative. And we are behind other industries in how we make use of some of these technologies. And even in clinical development specifically, I would say that we're behind our peers in drug discovery and drug development because they're working in a different environment and trying to achieve different things. But it is worth considering that. So if we look at the left-hand side of the screen, we're probably all quite familiar with some of these applications and use cases around classical AI. So risk-based site monitoring, large-scale data analytics, and the use of natural language processing for medical coding, adverse event processing. These are pretty standard practice and are rolled out in most organizations. So I'm sure we're all quite familiar. But it's worth saying that just because these tools and techniques are well established doesn't mean that we're not seeing new use cases, new applications being developed and piloted. So in the middle of the slide, you'll see some of these examples. So first of all, adaptive protocol optimization. So really using technology to basically simulate a protocol and understand what elements of this protocol are going to be burdensome to patients or difficult to operationalize or are likely to result in low enrollment based on existing data that we have, and trying to use that information to optimize protocol design. TMF bots, so lots of organizations are exploring this at the moment. It's obviously a really big opportunity to reduce some of the high labor manual activities that are associated with managing a trial master file. So there's a big opportunity for auto categorization and completeness checks and things like that with the TMF. And that's being explored a lot, but is not at scale or standard practice across our industry yet. And similarly, data-driven site feasibility. There are many, many tools, platforms, methodologies for doing this based on modeling and prediction. But again, a lot of this is being done in pockets in organizations, but is not necessarily totally scaled or totally standard practice. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, thinking about what we're seeing in terms of applicability of next generation AI in clinical development. And as I said, this is really early stage exploration. We're seeing a few pilots, a few proof of concepts, a few examples of this being deployed. And I'll just call out a few. So one of them is causal AI for understanding patient enrollment. This is something actually Syneos Health are exploring at the moment. So trying to understand why patients aren't enrolling or aren't getting through screening or are dropping out of clinical trials so that we can really shape study design based on understanding the why behind that. So that's where the causal AI comes in. And then for generative AI, obviously, document drafting is a huge potential area here. We're definitely seeing this being trialed, but also seeing a lot of organizations deciding that for some documents, it's not actually currently appropriate. So does it make sense to author whole SOPs or whole protocols using generative AI? Some organizations are not convinced yet, but the opportunity and the potential is definitely there, and it's being more and more explored. And then lastly, multimodal patient identification. So there are a few nice examples of this being used in oncology, where you're looking to identify patients or plan treatment regimens based on not just health record data, but also potentially imaging data or genetic data. And there's a few good examples of that being done in practice, but again, not being done at any kind of scale. So I think one of the takeaways here is that some established tools and techniques are being used widely, but most AI-powered tools in clinical development are still in pilot stage. And from our experience, an estimated that fewer than 10% of proof of concepts actually make it through to any scale. So there's still a lot of untapped opportunity. So if this is currently what we're seeing, what do we think is coming next? So it's worth saying that what's really important, and I think we'll all agree, is that it's about deploying the right solutions at scale to tackle the key challenges in clinical development. So if we think back to that first slide where I spoke about what are the main things that we're all trying to do, trying to improve operational efficiency, trying to handle all of these different types of data at an increasing volume, trying to make sure that we've got good quality underneath all of that. Are we really using the tools and techniques available to us in order to do that right now and really move the needle, so to speak, on some of those items? I would say in some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, no. And it's really important to say that some of these things will be achieved not through innovative technologies, maybe not even through technology at all. There's still a lot of value in looking at processes, organization, ways of working in order to make improvements there as well. But while we are thinking about technology, I think one of the key things is that established and classical techniques still have huge amounts of value to bring us, especially in handling large volumes of complex data, especially in pushing forward operational efficiency. So we don't need to go always to the new shiny solutions just because they're available. So if you see on the left-hand side here, I speak about automation and machine learning. So lots of applicability of automation in data cleaning, data reconciliation, extracting, integrating, and harmonizing data from different sources. And then in the operational efficiency, enrollment forecasting, budgeting, and resource allocation, and predicting patient retention. So all really strong applications that would really help us in a lot of ways that are not being used at scale, but use pretty standard and established techniques. However, that's not to say that there isn't huge amounts of value to get from some of the emerging technologies. And especially in the near term, we're starting to see that happening. I mentioned some of the pilots that we're already seeing in practice. But if I look at some of these next generation tools and methodologies, generative AI, I've already said, huge potential for document generation. We're just needing to be careful about how exactly that's applied. But I think that's going to become more and more rolled out in different organizations. Causal AI, I think, has huge potential applications. So if we could replace placebo arms or certain real world data activities with virtual synthetic trials that are based on existing collected data, and that we are confident in the conclusions that we're drawing from it because we have a causal understanding, not just a correlated understanding, then that has huge potential to reduce the amount of actual clinical studies that we maybe need to run, especially in certain things like control arms and placebo arms. In terms of multimodal AI, again, multi-source data analytics, getting that more and more to be standard practice, and then trying to shift that into kind of real-time rolling analysis. And then lastly, agentic AI. Again, if we're really wanting to shift as an industry to continuous lock-ready data, so rather than gathering all your data and then at the end of the study, cleaning it and locking it, actually having your data cleaned and basically submission ready as you go, agentic AI can definitely get us much closer to that. So these are probably some of the things that we might expect to see coming in the sort of near term. But I want to take a little bit of a step back and think about what might be the kind of big picture if we were really going to revolutionize or disrupt the way that we do clinical development. Because a lot of what I've spoken about here are incremental improvements built on our existing data and technology, which, if we're honest, is often quite fragmented. There's lots of legacy tools and legacy data flows that don't really join up together. And so I want to use a little bit of an analogy, if you'll let me. So I'm originally from Scotland, and those of you who might be familiar with our capital city of Edinburgh might know that we have a big castle overlooking the whole city. And it's beautiful, but it really is an interesting building. As you might see from the picture, it's built on multiple layers, and basically over the last 900 years, it's been added to bit by bit by bit. So there's different architecture, there's different bits here and there. And it really is a nice example of something that's been added to over hundreds of years, and is basically built on legacy. And that's what we're doing with some of these tools and new technologies. We're trying to layer them on top of fairly old and disconnected data flows and systems. So thinking about how this could be different, if we really want to shift the way that we do clinical development, then we potentially need to consider an entirely new approach built from the ground up. And I've used this beautiful building in Seoul as an example of purpose-built architecture. So we're really trying to go for total innovation in terms of what's possible with the technology if we had the underlying data and systems to support it. It really is feasible to conceive of a situation where end-to-end clinical development is much, much more automated and driven by agentic AI technologies, causal AI methodologies, and so on. So really going right from we've got a new product that we want to test in humans and we want to get it to submission readiness. You can imagine how you could generate a target product profile, a protocol, you could simulate that protocol and optimize it. You could generate all of the documentation that you need associated with that using generative AI. Of course, with human in the loop, I assume, for a lot of this. You could do your country and site feasibility. You could create bespoke communications to reach out to those sites. You could then actually start to build your study in EDC automatically based on your protocol so that you're ready to capture the electronic data at sites. You can then ingest that data from all different sources, your site and your vendors. You can clean it, you can analyze it, and then at the end, you can lock your database and generate your study report and submission documents. In theory, so much of this is possible to be done by technology with much, much less human involvement. But I think we will all agree that we're really, really not there yet. And part of that is not because the technologies don't allow it, but part of it is, well, one, our regulatory landscape, but also the fact that we're dealing with a lot of legacy systems and infrastructure. So coming back to what we might actually be practically doing in the immediate term and near term, I think about how do we actually get moving with some of this. So basically, what's stopping us? So I like to separate this into two main categories. We have our business challenges. how are we kind of getting in our own way, and then the structural challenges, which are maybe a bit more systemic and need to be addressed in a different way. In terms of business challenges, we're still seeing poor collaboration between business and leadership, end users in clinical development and clinical operations, IT, and by that I mean traditional IT teams, and development, and by that I mean kind of the teams that develop AI-powered tools. So part of that is around leadership understanding. A lot of people have a pretty good grasp of how traditional technologies work and can be applied. But these new technologies are a completely different frontier. And we're really seeing a lack of understanding of the opportunities, but also the limitations in how they can be applied. And there's a massive hype cycle as well. And the number of people I've spoken to who have said to me, my boss has told me I need to do Gen AI or I need to figure out AI and make it happen. And obviously, that's not really a kind of problem-based approach to applying these technologies. So there's definitely some improvements to be made there. There's also an interesting offset between how easy it is to build a proof of concept AI-powered tool. So lots of the kind of open source technologies make it really easy to build something quite cool and quite effective and that can do a little bit of work for you. But then it's actually disproportionately hard to scale that compared to traditional IT. Having that be validated, reliable, repeatable, whatever it needs to be, having people trust in it and have the confidence and then adopting it is actually disproportionately hard, even though it's maybe disproportionately easy to create something cool that does what you're looking to do. And then lastly, and this isn't just for new technologies, but in everything that we make in this industry, we could do better with getting more end user input and trying to drive adoption. So we're still seeing a lot of examples of development teams working on pet projects or making something because they can, not because it's useful. So basically what I'm trying to say is that there's no one to blame across all of these groups on the poor collaboration, but there is a lot that can be done in having forums and collaboration approaches to bring these groups together. And that's a lot of what we've been trying to help organizations with, and having frameworks for understanding what is it we're trying to do as an organization? Where are these innovative technologies going to help us? Do we have a business case? Do we understand how we're going to actually pilot this and scale it up if it works, or how we're going to say, no, we're not going to continue with it if it doesn't, and how we're going to measure the value of all of that as well. So there's quite a lot that can be done there. Then I'll just touch quickly on some of the structural challenges as well. So obviously our regulatory landscape is complicated. And what I will say is that our regulators are being proactive in understanding how we're going to handle some of these new technologies and the outputs coming from them. But there's still quite a long way to go. I think we can all agree. And as organizations as well, it's not just the regulators, we are risk averse. Legal and compliance teams are often the ones that have to kind of put a bit of a pause on some innovative activities as they figure out whether or not they're comfortable as an organization with the risk. And then also there are just some classic issues with access to data that helps us build these tools and access to the tools that build the tools as well. So a lot of kind of innovative and development teams are saying, you know, I'm not getting sign off to use our data, or I'm not getting sign off to use this new tool. And so that's something that we need to look at addressing as well, and that takes time. So I just want to wrap up with some key takeaways. I've got four key points. AI is not currently being deployed at transformative scale in clinical development, but we are seeing widespread use of some of the kind of classical tools and technologies, and also incremental solutions increasingly being put in place. I really think we shouldn't over-index on the flashy new next generation technologies in situations where the more established tools and techniques still have a lot of value to give us in addressing some of the key challenges in clinical development. And then it's important to consider both short-term wins as well as longer-term technologies and capabilities. So we think back to those two buildings, the Edinburgh Castle and the DDP. It's important that we kind of balance our investment and prioritization as organizations across what's going to give us that incremental build and add on as a quick win, but also make sure that we're investing for the long term, building that data infrastructure technology stack that's really going to allow us to get to the next evolution of clinical development. And then lastly, that the greatest limitations in clinical development to realizing the value from these technologies are our own ability to collaborate across our teams and also the regulatory environment. But it's not necessarily the technology that's limiting us. It's there. We just need to understand how best to harness it in a way that doesn't compromise any of the patient integrity that's so important to us all. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation. I look forward to taking questions.